Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you and to our honorable guests. Welcome to the day 3, which is the last day of the inaugural European Research Days 2020 Australia and New Zealand, a flagship event of Euraxess Australia and New Zealand, organized in collaboration with the Delegation of European Union to Australia and the Delegation of European Union to New Zealand. My name is Nishant Sandile, and I am the regional representative for Euraxess Australia and New Zealand. We are delighted to have so many of you join this event for the past 2 days. For those who are joining our event for the very first time, Euraxess is an initiative of the European Commission that addresses barriers to the mobility of researchers and seeks to enhance scientific collaboration between Europe and rest of the world. We provide free information about European research, career opportunities, international collaboration, and networking possibilities. Since all of you are watching this on your laptop or phone, I will encourage you to type Euraxess Australia and New Zealand on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook and follow us there. Moving on to today's session, just to give you the running order, we will kick off the day with the first session, which is a high-level panel in collaboration with DAAD Australia on research and innovation dimension of universities and their European relations. In an hour's time, we will move on to a special session in collaboration with S4DC, which is using science for diplomacy for addressing global challenges. We will close this 3-hour day and the event with the highlight session on Horizon Europe, the next research and innovation framework program of the EU, and the EU's Green Deal. I'd like to encourage all of you to please use the question function in the Zoom interface to ask your questions while our speakers are speaking. We will come back to take your questions towards the end of the session. Now, without further ado, please allow me to pass the platform to Ms. Katerina McGrath, who is the director at DAAD Australia, who will be the moderator of the first session. Over to you, Katerina.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Nishant, and hello and welcome to every one of you to this wonderful panel on research and innovation dimensions of Australian and European higher education institutions and research institutions. Please allow me to introduce my fabulous panel members, who I'm very grateful that they made the time out of their busy schedules to join us today. I'd like to start with Professor Duncan Iveson, who is the DVC Research at the University of Sydney since 2016. After high-ranking international career, including fellowships and academic appointments at excellent universities spanning over 3 continents, Duncan is currently the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Professor of Political Philosophy at the University of Sydney. Professor Iveson is also Chair of the University of Sydney Confucius Institute Board, the Chair of the Group of 8 DVCR Committee, a member of the Australian Research Council's Advisory Council, and a member of the Council of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Our next panel member is Professor Jim McCluskey. Professor McCluskey is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of Melbourne. He is classically trained as a physician and pathologist, and then Jim's internationally acclaimed research led him through academic appointments at excellent higher education institutions to become the Professor of Microbiology and Immunology at the University of Melbourne, before commencing his position as a DVCR in 2011. And Professor McCluskey has led the development of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection Immunity, and in 2012 he was elected to the Fellowship of the Australian Academy of Science. And please allow me to welcome also Chris Whelan. Chris Whelan is the Executive Director of Universities New Zealand, and with a background in history and business, Chris commenced his professional career with Victoria University of Wellington before joining New Zealand Police. He then moved on to become the Director of Support Services at the New Zealand Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And his last appointment before commencing his current role in 2014 was the Manager for Planning, Strategy and Services at the University of Canterbury. So, as you can see, we have a highly experienced, diverse panel, and I can't help myself but notice that this is the first panel I have ever encountered in a situation like this, where 75% of the panelists have a background in humanities, and the moderator included.
Well, I say it's about time, Jim, that you were surrounded by some people, you know, properly educated.
This is an ambush. I knew this was going to happen.
So to start off this panel, please allow me to give a little context to the background of research and innovation dimensions between the European Union and Australia. So generally, the diplomatic relations were established in 1952, and they have grown over the years to many areas, from a predominantly economic partnership into a politically strategic one. Australia is a very important, like-minded partner for the European Union in the area of research and innovation cooperation, and they have a long history of productive research collaborations underpinned by the first treaty-level science and technology agreements signed by the EU with an industrialized country in 1994. Australia has more collaborations with the European Union than any single country in the world, averaging over 13,000 co-publications per year. And Australia was the European Union's 5th highest non-EU collaborator as well. So generally, those research and innovation dimensions that we're going to talk about today, they range from people-to-people linkages to subject-specific bi- and multilateral collaborations, as well as institutional linkages and politically guided, motivated linkages. I'm trying to give those 4 areas as a bit of a scope, and to see that yes, we have various areas and also various levels on which research and innovation and collaboration within research and innovation between Australia and the European Union happens. They do really happen in networks of single researchers that then expand onto subject level, that then grow into more institutionalized linkages, but they can also be grown in top-down processes which are politically guided and motivated. An example, for example, would be the Australian-German supply chain feasibility study of hydrogen produced from renewables, and within the hydrogen strategies released by both countries, and I believe that UNSW is leading this feasibility study, or has been awarded the RC grant to lead this. So this is just a very brief little overview. I think talking about those dimensions and giving examples, we could probably spend days and weeks just giving examples of excellent collaborations that there are. But Professor McCluskey and Professor Iverson, I would like you, for your respective institutions, to ask you if you could please briefly summarize the relationships your institution has with European research or higher education institutions, and maybe specifically highlight which collaborations stand out or have been most successful to date.
Shall I go first, Duncan?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Katerina, and thank you, Nishant and Euraxess, for this opportunity to address you all. Yeah, I think probably like the whole of the sector in Australia, Europe is one of our major research partners. We do more with Europe, if you count the UK, than we do with North America, which is very substantial. The pecking order usually goes US, UK, Germany, China, Germany. That toggles a bit. But we're doing an awful lot with the whole of Europe, and it exceeds that of North America. Look, I think probably like most universities, 80%, the lion's share of our engagement in Europe would be researcher or investigator driven. It would be legacy arrangements from where people trained, or collaborations that got struck in a bar or a coffee shop on the fringes of a scientific meeting. And that's crucially important. And I like to reference that because our research community rolls their eyes when they hear us talking about international engagement, when they feel they do an awful lot of that themselves, and they do. It's not necessarily institutionally strategic, it's investigator driven, but crucially important. At an institutional level, we made a decision a few years ago to engage more deeply with Germany. We felt that geopolitically this was the heart of Europe. Physically, it's the heart of Europe. It's got a terrific research system, university system, the institute system, the Helmholtz, Leibniz, Max Planck, and Fraunhofer institutes, which are all networked to universities. It's very well funded. The Germans speak better English than the Australians, and they love Australia. And actually, I quite love Germany. So it's been very successful for us, and the key vehicle has been through international joint research training groups. So we now have about just under 250 PhD students engaged in joint PhD studies at the University of Melbourne and a European university. They include Bonn, Leuven, some in the UK, which I'm counting as Europe for the moment. And I think they've been particularly effective because they allow multidiscipline engagement with German and other European institutions. They allow mobility among a group that are seeking mobility, and that become ambassadors of the university, that carry no baggage, and that are very excited to work across two institutions. And so that's worked really well. The Berlin University Alliance has been particularly powerful with the Berlin institutions. The Technical University there, the Freie University, Humboldt, and Charité Hospital, which is not a university, but it behaves like one. And so that covers all disciplines and means that the footprint is broad and strong. And it's actually allowed our arts community, creative and performing arts communities to engage with the incredible creative and performing arts ecosystem in Berlin. So I would highlight that as particularly impressive. But just to end, the link with Bonn has been a big surprise to us. It's very discipline focused. It's all around immunology. It was built on two individuals who trained in Melbourne, gone back to be big shots in Bonn. And it's now funded by DFG. And so, resources are all important in driving these relationships. And so it just takes some of the heat out of the exchange and the mobility and the collaborative work. And we now have a 9-year runway on this program. We will have 100 PhD students emerge from this. And remember, they get 2 testamers, University of Bonn, University of Melbourne. And so we find it manages to attract particularly strong students, often students who are neither from Germany nor Australia, which is very interesting.
Thank you very much, Jim. Duncan, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, a bit like Jim, I mean, obviously we have big, vast engagement with Europe through our researcher community, and a long-standing one going back, over 100 years, and that thrives, and we've really built on that. A staggering number of co-publications has emerged from those individual relationships, as Jim said. A bit like Melbourne, but different, as you would expect. 4 or 5 years ago, we decided to take a slightly different approach to our global engagement more generally, and we decided we'd really identify 15 or 16 institutions globally that we really wanted to develop close working relationships with, and we kind of had a process for identifying that. And amongst those include 3 really significant European partners: the Sorbonne, Utrecht, and the University of Copenhagen. And those relationships have really, really flourished. I mean, Copenhagen in particular, I think our leading, the team will crucify me if I get this wrong, our leading partner is CNRS in France, with whom we've had deep, long-term relationship. But Copenhagen and Utrecht have really emerged in the last few years. And they're part of this sort of 15 or 16 what we called sort of preferred partnerships, and more recently the Sorbonne has joined that list. So when I was preparing for this talk, I suddenly realized that in fact our engagement with France probably mirrors a bit Melbourne's engagement with Germany, and draw whatever wonderful metaphor you want between Franco-German Sydney-Melbourne relations. But our relationships with France are quite deep and are growing. And again, that's been researcher driven, but also we've got to know the institutions well. And as the French universities have been consolidating, and as the French government has been prioritizing higher education, I think we've really benefited from that. And we're seeing, a bit like Jim, we're seeing a lot more engagement between our research students across those institutions, and we're really seeking to build on that. So that sort of preferred priority partnership has been a really successful model, and a bit like, as Jim said, it means it isn't just driven necessarily by the cancer researchers or the immunologists who might have, been the original sort of owners of that relationship. It's really broadened out, and even to the point now where the executives of the universities are developing relationships. And until COVID, we've had some really wonderful engagements between sort of institutional partners and not only research partners. And I think that helps the relationship sort of blossom and develop and grow in all kinds of exciting ways. I mean, obviously for us, and if Vicky was here, she'd be talking about this. I mean, for us, it's really how can we create the opportunities for Australian universities to participate even more deeply in European research and innovation system more broadly. If you look at the investment that the Europeans will be making in research and development, it will be extraordinary over the next 5 to 10 years. And we haven't been so good at that as a country. And so I think that's something that I'm really keen to continue to advocate for and find ways to persuade the Australian government to think seriously about how we incorporate this into some of the discussions around free trade, or some of the discussions around the emerging relationship between Europe and Australia, and Europe in relation to the Indo-Pacific kind of more generally. So yeah, a bit like Melbourne, we've decided to take a more targeted approach. The French and I guess Netherlands and the Danish universities have emerged as really strong partners. And I guess we're thinking of the next phase of those relationships over the next 3 or 4 years as well.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And thank you also for the lead over to the role peak bodies play, such as the DAAD or Universities New Zealand. And with this, I would like to hand the next question over to you, Chris. Which role do those peak bodies actually play in the process of establishing and maintaining those international collaborations with European research institutions? Or where do you, as the CEO of Universities New Zealand, do see the role that Universities New Zealand plays within this, compared to the specific strategic approaches that the individual universities have in their collaborations?
So I'll talk in sort of a slightly theoretical sense first before I sort of come down a level. I have a lot to do with all the other sort of peak bodies, Universities Australia, Canada, UK, and so on. And we share notes, and we all work in a roughly similar space. The single biggest difference is how many universities we represent. And I think if there is a model internationally, or if there is a rule of thumb internationally, it is that any system that is, I don't know the number, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 12 universities, it can collaborate and can work closely together. Anything bigger than that, then it tends to fragment. And so you have in Australia groups like the Group of 8, which are small. They are thematically cohesive. In other words, they very similar range of interests, and a much greater ability to collaborate than perhaps a group like Universities Australia, covering, correct me if I'm wrong, 38 universities. So Universities New Zealand, we have just 8 universities. We are a Group of 8, small letters rather than big letters like the Australian one, but we're able to operate in a very similar way. So, for example, this morning, our 8 Deputy Vice-Chancellors of Research were meeting, working through a range of strategic issues. Just a couple of weeks ago, our research officers were meeting, our Committee for International Policy, which is the body that looks at everything from international PhDs and internationalisation, both inbound, outbound sort of student mobility, is meeting next week. And our Vice-Chancellors, all of our Vice-Chancellors meet every couple of weeks online and more intermittently in person. So one of the benefits of a small system, and actually being a small country of just 4.7 million people, we kind of know everyone, and we actually work extremely well together. So when our DVCRs collectively identify a strategic priority, the role of Universities New Zealand is to help basically facilitate that. We have the networks, and in fact are located just 50 metres from our government research, science and innovation agency. We are about 200 metres from our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and we have very close relationships with these organisations. So a lot of our job is to be able to identify what the win-wins look like. What is it that our government wants to achieve? And our government has Europe as a priority. What is it that our researchers want to achieve? And about half of all the research that is published in New Zealand universities has at least one European co-author, majority, again, echoing earlier comments, majority German and UK, if you still count the UK as part of Europe. What we don't have as much is at this stage, is the strategic focus on, the more strategic engagements for research with Germany. There's a lot of individual university to university. There are a lot of research to researcher, but we don't have much yet in the system to system level as compared with other countries where we are working more strategically at this stage. So the role of us as a peak body is really to be able to work out where the opportunities are. We can bring together our entire, representatives from our entire system, government and university, to be able to make them work. We can actually get money in behind priorities, and a lot of our job is being able to make the business case, both back into the university system and into government, where we see opportunities to be able to leverage some of these things.
Thank you very much, Chris. That sounds like a wonderful working climate that you have established throughout with your university partners throughout New Zealand.
I should say though, immediately though, we try to get 8 vice-chancellors, 8 DVCRs, 8 international directors, 8 research officers. You end up, yes, having to navigate an awful lot of different sort of opinions and viewpoints. And I think that's always the art of, what is possible in this space.
Sure. Yes, of course. For this basically covers our first topic point, which was more focusing on the existing research collaborations with European institutions and also on a more national or policy level. I would like to now a little bit critically look onto the current situation, and back to you again, Chris, with the first question. From your point of view, what are the current issues that either you as Universities New Zealand or that your member universities have mentioned in conversations in the various committees? What are the current issues related to collaborative research with European institutions, and how do you believe they could possibly be addressed?
Not an easy question to answer, but I think it has to be approached at 2 levels. It is that strategic, and more that strategic is one level, and the other level is more the researcher investigator-led sort of level. At the more strategic level, our government has relatively limited focus on European collaborations, much stronger focus around Australasia and Asia. But we do have a government-funded research councillor in Brussels, and basically, as part of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and associated with our Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, very much focused on how do we build those more strategic relationships and share sort of infrastructure and such. Our challenges, and I think universal message. Our challenges are funding. The EU funding programs, as we understand them, generally require New Zealand institutions to contribute or source their own funding, and that is, usually a challenge at the strategic level. Research for universities in New Zealand certainly is usually a lost leader. It's done, it's done because it's important. It's done for reputational purposes, but it usually means that it's hard to find funding for worthy activities that will need capital. And from our point of view, the EU funding programs are complex and difficult to navigate through. We know, for example, the conversations in recent years around Horizon Europe starting next year, long discussions around how to make it easier for third countries to get involved, but we're still not really seeing a lot of daylight around that. So that's at the more strategic level. I mean, it is around funding, and it's around the sort of settings that enable those more strategic relationships to take place. At the more investigator or research-led level, I think from our point of view, it's mostly around building those long-term relationships. So we did a study a year ago, 370 PhD alum who had left New Zealand and returned home, and we just wanted to know where they'd gone and what they were doing. And we found of those PhD students, 53% had retained a connection with New Zealand, and almost every single one of them was still working at a university, was actually still collaborating with New Zealand researchers and actively publishing with them. So for us, it's about making sure we are building those long-term relationships. I think the more we are exchanging our people to be able to do, New Zealanders doing PhDs in Europe, Europe being able to do PhDs in New Zealand, and building those long-term relationships where we have aligned strategics or priorities. I think those are the long-term wins, because there's a lot of stuff that you can do without a large amount of money, just with those research and investigator-led projects.
Thank you very much, Chris, for answering this very difficult question. I'm aware that it's always can be quite uncomfortable also to talk about the challenges, but they need to be addressed and they need to be discussed in order to find solutions that benefit both sides. I think one of the changes that were introduced also because of this discussion around funding was that for the last round, the ERC Synergy Grant actually now allows one PI as well from a foreign institution within the grant application. So that was, I think, one of the changes that already, I think, also evolved around one of those discussions like we're having at the moment, of course, on a larger scale. Jim and Duncan, from the institutional point of view, what would you say, which measures would need to be introduced to intensify those very strategic Australian-European research relations that you already have, but what would need to happen to take those institutional collaborations to the next level? If there is a next level to reach.
Yeah. Well, vaccine for COVID would be a great start.
That's right. I was going to say.
Look, I think Chris has alluded to, the one of the big hurdles, which is that, sustained research collaboration requires mobility and projects require resourcing, and that's always a challenge when you're trying to deal with somebody overseas, and Europe's no different. If we were associate members of Horizon Europe, this would make life so much easier. And I understand that that's going to be a part of the discussion of the next session. So I do think strategically, geopolitically, it would be a very, very sensible move for us. Yeah, and then I think our national funding agencies could play a role, and NHMRC certainly does allow fund some European collaborations. It funds the Australian end, and Europe funds the European end, but it's only peer reviewed at the European end, and so that's a very clever and efficient way of fostering very strong research that's peer-reviewed, that's internationally benchmarked, and then it ticks the box of funding at both ends. It would be terrific if the Australian Research Council could find its way to do something similar. Of course, the great threat to our national funding agencies is that they get many more applications than they can fund, and that the success rates of your vanilla project type grants are below 1 in 5 and often worse, and that's politically sensitive. And so if you're hiving off resources for an international scheme, it needs to be done in a way that doesn't impact on existing success rates. But I think funding is only one part of the story. In any international collaboration, indeed any collaboration, has an activation threshold that requires there to be trust between the parties, institutional trust and also investigator trust, some form of complementarity, and some shared interests, shared missions, shared goals. So you've got to hit those targets. You've got to overcome that activation energy. It's one of the reasons why we've done so much with PhD programs, because they're good at this. They're younger and they're good at it. And generally what happens is the supervisors get dragged along, and finally a relationship builds, and then you get that activation threshold dealt with. But certainly I think it's not just all about the funding. We found it terrific to work with the funding agencies in Europe. Indeed, we do have a joint PhD program in France funded by CNRS, as well as our links to DAAD and DFG and others. And that having that relationship is important, but we often, we want to take back the message to the NHMRC and ARC that there's this desire and hunger to form stronger links, but mindful that the local political agenda about disbursement of funding and funding rates is quite a sensitive topic for them. So I think some of the measures, I would still put, frankly, the personal chemistry, trust, alignment, complementarity, shared vision as the biggest hurdle. It's bigger than the funding, because if you overcome that and there's a desire, people will find a way. But they are clearly interdependent, the funding and that other part. And so I think to some degree, mobility, you can't form a relationship with one visit. You need to keep going back, and you need to keep in contact, and there needs to be reciprocal traffic. And, that's probably a place where, for quite a modest investment, you could kindle that first activation threshold quite nicely, and hope that it takes off on its own without the other big ticket funding.
Thank you
Duncan,
very much.
your reflections, Duncan.
Oh, look, I mean, I think Jim's summarized that beautifully. I was gonna say it really isn't only about the funding, although, funny enough, my last trip on an international flight was to Brussels to talk about these issues with colleagues in the European Commission. Then, look, the only thing I'd add to Jim is, I think the challenge is for Australia is that it's a kind of zero-sum game at the moment. If we were to become associate members of the EU, that would be fantastic, but the funding would have to be found, and the fear is, as Jim said, is that it comes at the cost of funding that is already under enormous pressure. So that is something we really have to be careful about. I mean, I do also think, though, I think there's an opportunity for us to think about Europe's engagement with the region as a way of kindling those relationships that Jim talked about. And I'd love to see us thinking about that creatively and working with our Europe. And this is something we're trying to do in our own small way with our global partnership schemes. For example, we have something we call the Sydney Summit. And every year we bring all of our global partners to Sydney. We offered to sort of, have it in Berlin or Paris or wherever, but everyone just keeps wanting to come to Sydney. So how do we find a way? And I think, you know, you're looking at the geopolitical competition between the US and China. You're seeing Germany and France think about the Indo-Pacific in a new way, and reaching out to the Australian government and political classes to engage on those issues. And I just think, as always, universities should be leading from the front, not only in terms of geopolitics, but climate and culture and all the issues that are so critical alongside those geopolitical ones. So I'd like us to think, you know, I think one of the challenges we've got is how do we, you know, create that two-way traffic and not simply worry about how we get to Europe and how we get funding to work with our European partners in Europe, but how do we actually create genuine partnerships where our European friends are not only visiting, but actually co-investing with us in projects that we really care about. And if you look at, you know, I was just the other night looking at the, you know, the new priorities for Horizon Europe, and, you know, 3 of them, for example, you know, it's climate change, healthy oceans, I think is one of them, cancer, obviously. I mean, these are all, we share really interesting perspectives given our location in the world, and how do we create those genuine partnerships that in the past might have been very northern oriented? How do we make it north-south?
Thank you very much, Duncan. And that's exactly, like, I work for an organization, the German Academic Exchange Service. It's called the Exchange Service, and our motto is change by exchange. So it is never just a one-directional approach. It always has to be a bi or multi-directional approach when it has to add value to both sides and to add value to the collaboration in itself. And so, yeah, mobility funding and mobility program, yes, mobility funding might not be the great money. It might not be the hard research money. It might not be great amounts, but it can make or break sometimes collaborations when collaborators are actually able to sit down together and even with small amounts over a year or 2 are able to map out a project, are able to map out future plans, are able to establish a track record throughout the mobility funding to then use for larger funding applications. And this can really sometimes have a big influence on the establishment of excellent research collaborations between Australia and European member states. Chris, for New Zealand universities, or for New Zealand and universities New Zealand, where do you see the value? Like, we have talked about the challenges, we have talked about that underlying, but I mean, New Zealand and New Zealand institutions and European institutions do collaborate on a very intensive level, and there must be value behind it, otherwise neither the institutions nor the researchers would invest their time and their money.
Yeah, and this is one where, again, hard to know where to start, because the value is across a huge number of overlapping areas. I mean, New Zealand, we're a small country at the end of the world. We generate less than 0.5% of the world's knowledge. We need connections to the rest of the world to fill in those gaps. And there is just so much knowledge and so much more capacity out there that, you know, in partnership, you know, by harnessing that, we can solve a whole lot of our own sort of particular sort of challenges or needs, and we can contribute to solving, you know, some of the issues that have just been outlined around things like climate change, oceans, cancer. You know, we have our own sort of expertise to contribute to that. But from our point of view, you know we get massive benefits from those people-to-people linkages. We know mobility, you know, generates a lot of benefits to us. Bringing people here, you know, everything that we see around our alumni studies sort of show that those ongoing linkages, sort of the people-to-people, trade, diplomacy, soft power linkages, you know, are massive for us. So, you know, it's why, to some extent, we work less in the kind of personal trust, you know, complementarity type space. Our job is more about trying to deal with the pain points for the institutions, which is the funding side, which is why probably, you know, we focus quite a bit on that, because without the money, it's very hard to get a lot of the other bits moving. But we know there's massive goodwill we know, huge desire to have those relationships and to be able to help generate the mutual benefits that come from them. From our point of view, though, as a peak body, most of our focus ends up in that money space. How do we avoid pretty much the points that have been made around Horizon Europe? How do we make sure we don't end up with funds being diverted, that it is adding, and we've got the same problems of, for every $5 of good ideas out there, there's only $1 of actual research funding. So, where are the genuine priorities?
Thank you very much, Chris. Duncan, where do you see the value that collaborating with European institutions adds for the University of Sydney specifically?
Oh, look, I mean, it's, as Chris said, it's all about the capability and the opportunity to leverage into an extraordinary set of institutions, an extraordinary array of talent. I mean, I think for us, there are some really powerful linkages in Europe, which kind of speak to our current research, I guess, strengths and the areas we're trying to invest in. I do think it's important also to be thinking, obviously we have deep relationships in the region, and that's always going to be vital. But you've got to be thinking about, not only where the talent is, but also where you can, I guess, spread your risk to a certain extent. We shouldn't be overly dependent on one part of the world for our research collaborations. So, and also I think Europe is increasingly, important in terms of the research directions that Horizon Europe is setting. I mean, those big missions are clearly putting a stake in the ground about enormous levels of investment in important questions that we have a lot of stake in as well. So it is about creating opportunities for our young people, creating opportunities for our colleagues, all the things that great universities need to do and have been doing for hundreds of years in many ways. But it's also about being strategic and smart about accessing extraordinary capabilities and resources that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And also, I guess to be slightly more provocative, I mean, flying the flag for global engagement and cooperation at a time where that's sometimes been seen to be problematic or difficult, at a time when nation states are kind of retracting and talking a lot about sovereign capability and talking a lot about doing things on our own. I think we need to be constantly thinking beyond our own borders and engaging beyond our own borders, and our relationships with our European partners is extremely important in that regard as well.
Also in terms of addressing global challenges within international research collaborations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting projects I've been part, when I was Dean of the Arts and Social Sciences, we received funding from the Commission to set up a human rights and democratization program in the Asia Pacific region. And it was a fantastic experience, and that was 4 universities in the region in Thailand, Indonesia, Australia, Hong Kong. Those were the days. And then a very close relationship with the Human Rights Commission, human rights agencies in Europe. And it was an extraordinary experience because, it brought together this cluster of global and regional institutions funded through the European Commission to look very differently at a human rights paradigm than was currently the case frankly, in Australia or North America. So it was quite a funky program, and it just demonstrated to me the kinds of innovative research, and in this case, it was combining research and teaching. It was all about how you embed human rights practice in place, informed by the latest research and the latest expertise. It's very different, quite edgy, and that's something that wouldn't have happened without that particular kind of concatenation of institutions and the kind of program that the Commission had identified as being important to their agenda at that time.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Jim, also the same question to you. For the University of Melbourne, where does the big or the most value between collaborating with European research institutions lie?
Well, first and foremost, it's simply the intellectual and engagement around big ideas and creating new knowledge that Europe has been, in Western democracy, a cradle of a lot of our way of thinking. And I think that is the major advantage is we know that by collaborating, you bring deeper insights into challenging problems and a broader, more mature perspective. It's invaluable when you're tackling big, hairy, audacious problems like migrating populations or statelessness, climate change, future energy policy, the future of work. We can't solve that on our own, and we need to understand how others are approaching these big challenges and put our heads together. And Europe is a very obvious and logical place for us to collaborate in those endeavors. I think there are some other advantages, of course. There's infrastructure in Europe, particularly impressive infrastructure that we don't have in Australia. That, in the physics world, the Large Hadron Collider would be known to most people, and we have groups working on that, and part of its governance and part of the whole community effort. And you couldn't do that without having those relationships. I think sometimes too, a lot of the collections that our humanities scholars depend upon, they're not all digitized, and they're sitting in esteemed places in Europe, and so there's another driver for collaboration. Quite simply, the substrate of the knowledge we're trying to derive isn't sitting here in Australia. And then I think, just as we in Australia and New Zealand are in some ways a portal to the Asia-Pacific region, Europe can be a portal where there's a degree of difficulty we can't manage on our own, particularly a portal to East Europe, a portal to the Middle East, where the relationship is deeper, longer, and Africa, and to some degree South America. So sometimes it's a triangulation that you're achieving that would be more difficult as a bilateral relationship. And so and there are a million reasons why we do this. And it's part of enriching our intellectual life and the quality of our research.
Thank you very much, especially the aspect of multilateral collaborations and cooperations that arises of those first people-to-people links, and then this one researcher also has a very good relationship to a different researcher in a third country, and then this fits in well within the scope, and suddenly you have this triangle that adds another layer of value to exactly the first bilateral collaboration. And that's something that we see on a global scale happening further and further, that we're moving from bilateral or collaborations to more conglomerates or like multilateral collaborations, where many institutions either in the same country or in different countries are involved in working together to attack one problem and kind of bundling their energies to focus on a certain topic, and therefore are able to achieve much like broader outcomes than they would otherwise be on a just bilateral level. Jim, sorry, we can't hear at the moment.
I'm not saying anything.
Okay. Okay. With this, I have tortured my wonderful panel enough with the quite difficult questions, and I would like to thank you for your very honest replies and also critical responses to my questions. Then I believe we're coming to the end of this panel, and I would like to thank all my excellent panelists, Professor Duncan Iverson, DVC Research at the University of Sydney, Professor Jim McCluskey, DVC Research at the University of Melbourne, and Mr. Chris Whelan, who is the CEO or the Chief Director of the University of New Zealand, for their willingness to participate, for taking the time out of their busy schedules, and of course for the quality and depth of discussing this topic with me within the given frame.